Hi everyone, so it's that time of the year again, we make another tier list. Diablo 4 is launching in 1 week from now, at least of the early access, and by far the most asked question right now is, which class is the best? Well, I made this tier list already back in the open beta in March, I believe, and I have these different categories by which I rank those classes. So we have early game, end game, build diversity, easiness to play, we have the speed, fun, that's very subjective, group utility, and hardcore. And now I have sat down and updated this list again with all of the new findings from the recent months, with all of the theorycrafting that we have done, with all the people I've talked to and all that. So if you're not aware, like basically for the past like 1 month or longer already, I've just been doing Diablo 4 planner streams, making builds here, and this is kind of where we're at now. I have made almost every single thing that I kind of had on my mind of stuff I could think of, stuff that I just discovered as I went basically. And we have a large range of builds here now that you can all find on my Discord. So if you just want to grab a build or just maybe check your ideas versus mine, I have spent a lot of time on this, literally hundreds of hours at this point, with preparing those leveling and endgame builds. So we have them grouped here, for example. So I think I have a pretty good idea of how everything works. Obviously, my main is Rogue. This is what I have spent the most time theory crafting, but I think I have a really good overview of all of the classes. I have played all of them as much as I could in the open betas. I had the press early access. I had, again, with the server slam. I played all of the classes multiple times, every single time I had access to the game. So I think I know pretty well at least the early game of all of those builds and how they will continue onwards later. While we're at it, mark your calendars. On the 30th of May, we will have all of the Maxwell guides for you guys as well. Not necessarily for all of these builds here, especially when it comes to those endgame builds, but we will have a ton of stuff for you, so get ready for that. I hope you're enjoying this video so far, but before we continue, a word from today's sponsor, Awesome Remote. This is a remote control software that allows you to access your PC remotely through your phone. So I went ahead and tried this out with Diablo 3 on my phone. So after logging in, I started customizing my keyboard controls. They have a few preset layouts that suit certain types of games, and then you can just take one of these and go from there. And that's exactly what I did. I added the different action buttons, for example, the 1, 2, 3, 4 for the skill slots, the potion slot. I had the B for my bags, and a escape button in case I want to close menus. Now, controlling the mouse cursor does require a little bit of practice, so it's obviously not going to be as efficient as actually playing the game on your PC, I would say. But if you're just trying to log in and maybe do a little task, or maybe just hang out and chat, or just check in on a trade, maybe in Diablo 4, for example, then this is definitely a pretty good option. Awesome Remote supports games up to 144 FPS and has tons of customization features. You also don't need to worry about breaching the terms of service with third-party violations or something like that, for example for Blizzard titles. All that the program does is send the screenshots from your PC that locally runs the game to your phone, and then you have access to it there. In addition to all that, the company offers the so-called smart plug that allows you to remotely turn on or off your PC from your phone as well, which is available in select countries. Awesome Remote can be used for countless different applications. They offer a few different plans, so go check them out on the website and with the link in the description below. And in addition to that, they gave me this free code that you guys can redeem on the website to get 7-day free trial access to Awesome Remote Game, the biggest pack they offer, for free. So go check it out. Now let's get into the tier list. We start with the first category here, which is early game progression. So I think that this is the category that most people can reference the easiest because, well, we were actually able to play it. Like all of us could play in the open beta, we could play again in the server slam. So especially those people that played recently with the new balance updates. Yeah, I imagine we're gonna see a lot of agreement here. So this is probably like pretty straightforward. I think that Rogue is by far the best in the early game. It's just really fast, especially with Twisting Blade, but not just that. There is other builds as well on the Rogue, and they're all just decent, fast, relatively powerful. And one big advantage that the Rogue has compared to other classes is that defenses don't really matter in the early game. So I expect this to continue at least until you hit Nightmare, at which point stuff probably gets harder and you have to, try to include more defenses, you have to slow down, be a bit more tactical, these kind of things. But for rushing through the campaign and all that, I think rogues are going to be the fastest. So this should be pretty obvious. Then we have Sorc and Necro. I think that these are relatively powerful classes. You have the Skellies, they got buffed later after they got nerfed before. So they're kind of in a good spot still. And yeah, all of the core skills kind of fine, especially Bone Spear is pretty good. You have Col's Explosion doing a lot of work. So generally Necro is okay. And I guess Sorc is just like almost anything you choose is just works well as well. And they have Hydra, they have the Fireball enchant, they have Arc Lash, so there's tons of options where you can just like easy peasy go through the early game content. Then we have Druid. Generally, I actually found Druid to be much improved in the server slam compared to the open beta. So I did not have any issues leveling a Druid, especially once those companions come in. So this takes a few levels, but I think it's like something like level 15 or something. You can start speccing into companions, and if you play around them properly and then, you know, do a good combo with your core skill, you can easily destroy almost everything. The main downside that the Druids have here are that they are relatively slow compared to the other classes, in my opinion. And then we have the Barb. Yeah, Barb is just like really slow start. You have the huge item scaling with all the weapons. You are relying on a lot of legendary aspects that make the class good. And this has not improved all too much, but it does pick up the pace relatively fast, especially after like level 15, level 20 or so. I would say Barbs are generally in a spot where you can already start working it out basically with, especially once the ultimates come in. You have good boss damage with the Ancients, for example, and it's going to be okay from there. Then comes the endgame potential. So here it's pretty much upside down of the early game stuff, I would say, almost. So if you look at this, I think that Necro is going to be the overall weakest class. It doesn't really seem like there are a lot of really good builds on Necro. So there's Bone Spear, which is going to be very good. There might be something like Bone Spirit. And outside of that, I don't really have too much hope of seeing like super good like builds that Bone Spear cannot simply trump with almost a similar playstyle. So this is basically what I expect there. While a lot of other classes I think are going to be overall solid with multiple builds. For example, Druid in particular. I think Druid is actually going to be the overall strongest class. Druid has, first of all, by far the most builds. What I have here is not even complete, so we might actually add more to that, but they have so many crazy combinations, and honestly, a lot of them look very powerful. So, you know, memes aside and all that, I think Druids have so much crazy endgame stuff with their spirit boons, with their legendaries that convert skills into another category. So suddenly you open up more synergies and you can combine this with this and that, and suddenly you have like a super crazy build. I think this is what makes Druids really, really strong, because they can just draw power from many different sources at once by converting skills, by making those kind of combinations. They have Grizzly Rage, which can be a really prominent tool in a lot of builds. Grizzly Rage is completely busted. And yeah, there's some other things like that. And on top of this, they are very tanky. They have great defensive passives. They have great defensive skills. They are just generally all around really powerful. And in my opinion, the main downside that Druids have is the relatively low mobility, but this will also improve later on, depending on the build. Especially werewolf builds are going to fly around the map. Then we have potentially like, you know, trample and trample reset type of builds with either trample slide or with pulverize. So there's a bunch of options that still make it a fast class, but not necessarily every build. But I think that in terms of raw power, just like, you know, walking in and one-shotting packs and these kind of things, being tanky, feeling good, I think Druid is the number one. And we have the Barb at the number 2. So originally I had Barb as the number 1 class, but they have received some nerfs, especially, for example, damage reduction while fortified, and, you know, some of the really powerful legendary aspects, such as Limitless Rage, Expectant, so something where you can build like a wombo combo and like a one-shot the boss kind of thing, has been nerfed. So I think they're still really, really powerful in late game because of their insane item scaling. They have more legendary aspects, they have more stats. They have very powerful effects as well, but yeah, they are maybe slightly behind the Druid. It's hard to say really, but I think that both of these classes are going to be like significantly, like noticeably stronger than the rest in the overall picture. And that being said, I think that Barb is going to also have the overall best build in the game, which is, in my opinion, Whirlwind. So this is on the side. Then we have Rogue and Sorc. So I gave them both a B here. Now, obviously, Rogue is not going to seem very bad, especially early on, because of the early game progression power it has. But basically, as you progress, the content is going to get more difficult as you go, basically. And with more difficult content comes more value in crowd controls and in defenses. And while the crowd controls are very good on Rogue, the defenses are not that easily built. So this is the main reason why I think the endgame potential on the Rogue is definitely lower than some of the other classes. I think the damage is going to be just fine, the speed is going to be very good, but the defensive side is like something that holds the Rogue back. Now, that being said, defenses in an RPG are also very much reliant on your capacity to play the game. So obviously a very good player is not going to have that many issues with Rogue than someone who just doesn't have like the mechanical, like, you know, muscle memory and the coordination and the reactions that maybe someone else has. So this is what the Rogue relies on. You are a very reactive class, or you just try to toy with the enemies, and if you do a mistake, you're gonna feel the consequences. Whereas, for example, on other classes, you just walk in and you do your thing and you don't really care. So this is kind of how that goes for Druid and Barb compared to something like Rogue. And then we have Sorc. I think Sorc is going to be alright. It's going to be like an overall solid class with a bit of potential for some potentially busted builds based around enchantments. In particular, I think Firewall, Ball Lightning, those builds, maybe Meteor as well, they could definitely pop off really hard later, depending on how well you can make those synergies work, how much you can proc all those enchantments, and just completely like annihilate everything. But outside of those three, I don't have too much hope for the Sorcs, but they're going to be okay. So it's not like they're going to be bad and they're going to have trouble. I think they're going to be just somewhere, you know, in the middle of the pack, basically. Not too tanky, not too powerful, but just fine everywhere. So this is what I expect. But on the other hand, there might not be that many builds that really pop off, and I also think that the power gap between builds inside the Sorcerer class is going to be the biggest. So this probably also comes down to like how well you can optimize each of those builds. For example, you know, some of those really like lucky hit reliant builds such as Meteor and Ball Lightning that I mentioned, like once you kind of like reach the critical mass, I think they can like really go crazy and go like, you know, exponential scaling. But if you don't reach that point, then they might just feel undertuned. So there's kind of like a very like wide swing and power that you're going to experience on a Sorc on some of those builds if you don't play something like more straightforward, such as Chain Lightning, for example. So also something to keep in mind. And then we have the Necros. So I mentioned that I think they're not really very strong. I think that, yeah, they have like this one good build, which is Bone Spear, maybe some other stuff as well. But for the most part, is that I don't really expect much of the skeletons. I don't think that scaly builds or minion builds that really rely on minions are going to be that great. But we'll see, maybe I'm surprised. But you can already feel that in the early levels that scaly just kind of like start slowing down and they don't really have many scaling mechanisms. So unless they get some huge power spikes from just leveling up, basically, later on, I kind of doubt it. Yeah, they're probably not that crazy. And yeah, the builds in general just don't really have that much really power. But to put all of this endgame stuff into perspective, I tried to kind of amplify the differences between classes here. So I just think that both Barb and Druid are going to be noticeably better overall once you're in the end game, once you're optimized and you have like a full build with the combo that you want, with good legendary aspects, with most of your paragons built. So this is what we're looking at. And I think at that point, with like, you know, basically everything set up, you're going to see that those two classes are going to be better. And then the other three are kind of like, you know, somewhere behind. So this is what I expect, at least. Now, this doesn't mean that none of these other classes can have like this one shining, super powerful build. As I mentioned, the Bone Spear, or, you know, maybe on Rogue, you know, maybe Twisting Blades just, it turns out that crazy in these kind of things. Maybe something on Sorc just like completely pops off later with all the synergies. But as an overall class, this is the ranking, okay? Let's get into build diversity. So I think that Druid is like the absolute winner here with, yeah, lots of combinations. I already described that. They have definitely the most builds. Sorcerer as well. I made a lot of stuff here and there's definitely more to be discovered. So obviously, like all these builds that I made are not the only builds that exist, and you can always make variations. Like, the entire game is built around choices, and this includes your skill tree, this includes your paragons. You can decide to, you know, add another utility choice, you can add more damage, more defense. There's always options to explore depending on what you need with your character right now. But in general, with like the different like variety of play styles, I think that Druid really wins there. And then the Sorc is kind of like close after that. Then we have the Rogue, which is almost entirely built around the 5 core skills, one of which cannot really be used on its own. So you basically have 4 main skills with Twisting Blades, Flurry, Barrage, and Penetrating Shot. But on the other hand, Rogue has lots and lots of situational tools, lots of choices you can make. You basically just need that 1 core skill, and then you have 5 skills on your bar that could be literally anything. And that is really the cool part. And there are lots of reasons to include basically every single one of those utility skills. And it's really up to you to decide, you know, how do you want to play your Rogue? Do you want to be stealthy? Do you want to use the traps? Do you want to use the imbuements? Do you want to be super fast and jump around everywhere? You can use the caltrops, you can use the ultimates. And everything kind of has its own reason to exist. So that is like the great part about Rogue, and why I think that for me as a main Rogue, this class will basically never get boring, because you can just play, you know, basically the same main skill with a completely different flavor every single time. So that is the cool part here. Then we have the Barbarian. I think Barbarians are also kind of in the same spot as the Rogue, maybe not quite as much variety when it comes to supporting skills. So they have a bunch of core skills, and they're going to be built around in every single case. And you don't have stuff like the Sorcerer enchantment slots or the Mastery skills and these kind of things, where you could like open up more synergies. There's maybe a bit of stuff like generator builds potentially with Lunging Strike or so, but not sure how long those will really hold up. We'll see. And then it's a kick maybe. But those are like the only other like options outside of core skills that may or may not actually end up being good. And yeah, then you have like shouts. So a lot of builds are based around shouts. I think also late game, a lot of builds will kind of ignore the other ultimates and just go Wrath the Berserker. So at least I put that in most of my endgame Barb theorycraft so far. I think that just berserking in general is going to be very powerful once you unlock those Paragon boards. So most Barb builds I expect are going to actually look and feel relatively similar. But there are some options to make some fun stuff work with, you know, leap, charge, kick, all that kind of good stuff. And finally, we have the Necro, where I feel like that, yeah, almost all of the builds are just like very like locked in. So you play a blood skill, you pick up all the blood passes, and you're done. You play a darkness skill, you pick up all the darkness passes, and you're done. So this is kind of how it goes on the Necro. They just have like a lack of skills on their skill tree, in my opinion. And yeah, while they do have the minions or not minions kind of play styles, generally it's just like, okay, you pick a core skill, you pick up everything that goes with it, and that's it basically. So I feel like there's not really that much to experiment with as on the other classes, which is a bit sad. Then we have the ease to play category. So this just ranks basically like how noob friendly those classes are overall. So again, you know, a certain class could have a certain super easy, smooth build. One example on the Sorc would be, for example, Arc Lash. If you play Arc Lash, you're going to have a decent time. It's a decent leveling build. It might actually hold up into late game as well. It's like a one-button thing, kind of. And you're not going to have any trouble. But as an overall class, you know, playing around the main mechanics of the class, yeah, I think Necro is overall the easiest. It is just maybe straightforward, very simple. So it kind of goes with the build diversity and this lack of skills. Yeah, you kind of know what you got on a Necro. And there's not really much to do wrong, I guess. So you just play your build, you spam Cold Explosion if you want, and that's about it. Very simple. Then we have the Druid. I think Druid is also overall a relatively simple class. So while it requires a big brain to actually make those builds, it does not really require one to play it. So, you know, you play like Polarize, you spam a Polarize into the pack, you play Tornado, you spam your Tornadoes into the pack, you know, kind of like that. So it's like really straightforward, you're tanky, so yeah, just press the defensive tools when you need to, and that's about it. I think that most builds on a Druid will just be, yeah, quite straightforward. Then we have the Barb, kind of similar story as the Druid. You have to build a tanky to play a Barb, basically, so to even exist. So you just walk in, you do your stuff. most of it is very straightforward. So there's like maybe a bit of positional stuff with upheaval, or a bit of timing with your shouts, with whirlwind and these kind of things. But in the grand scheme of things, I think barbs are generally kind of easy, outside of the fact that they are always in melee range and you are obliged to deal with elite affixes, to dodge attacks a little bit and these kind of things. So this is kind of like the only hard part about playing a barbarian, the staying alive part. But if you're doing easy content, if you don't have any trouble surviving, then this is like the smoothest sailing. Then we have the Sorc. So yeah, Sorc, I think that generally is a bit harder to play than most of the other classes, with the timing, with how you play around lucky hits, for example, with the enchantment slots. There are a lot of things where you really have to like fine-tune your setup and play it properly to actually make it work. They also have, for example, the aspect of control, where you get a stacking damage bonus for multiple CCs that you apply at the same time. So there's stuff like that on the Sorcerer, where the timing is key, so to say. So this is what makes Sorcerer like not very easy. So it's definitely a class for people that both want to build crazy stuff and then try to play around it. And lastly, we have the Rogue. So I gave the Rogue a D in easy to play, mainly because of the type of defenses that Rogue has, which is mainly Dark Shroud and crowd controls. And in both cases, you have to play around them and kind of synergize and harmonize between them so that you can stay alive. Obviously, what everyone experienced in the early game was that Rogue was just broken OP basically at level 20 with Twisting Blades, destroying Ashava, yada yada. Everyone has seen that. Yeah, of course, Rogue is nice when defenses don't matter, but I don't think this is gonna stay that way, and it's not gonna be super easy. So you have stuff like Twisting Blades that has like this insane fast-paced, jumping around kind of playstyle. You have the defenses. In general, a lot of positional requirements on the Rogue. I don't want to like demotivate anyone from playing a Rogue, but you definitely have to be aware that it's probably the hardest class overall. So just saying. Anyway, let's move forward with mobility and speed. So I think this is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I have to go much into detail here. Rogue is the fastest. You have all the movement speed and 2 mobility skills, and you can just spam everything if you want. Then close up behind, we have the Barb with, especially late game, I guess with the shouts, with, for example, they have a passive even that gives them straight up movement speed. They can have leap, charge, all that kind of good stuff. Especially once you have the damage, just like plow through everything. I think Barbs are going to be amazing and super fast and smooth. And we have teleport on the Sorc, which is also like late game going to have something like 4, 5, 6 seconds cooldown or so. So you're gonna like teleport an entire screen, every few seconds basically between every pack. You can even do like a teleport enchantment slot if you want to. So there are these kind of options, and you can just fly through zones of that. I think the Sorcs are gonna feel great once you have that cooldown reduction. And then we have Druid, kind of in between. That really depends on the build. There are like these kind of perma trample build where you like reset it with Nature's Fury and these kind of things. Yeah, sure. And you have maybe werewolf builds that are generally fast because of the shred dash and, for example, dire werewolf form giving you movement speed, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a bit like mix and match there on the Druid, depending on the setup. But because I think they're going to be very powerful, as we discussed earlier, I think the speed is going to be generally all right. Because maybe you have like a very slow moving build, but at least you one-shot everything. And then you have the Necro, which is just awful basically. So the only way to make a Necro kind of like not feel terrible in terms of mobility is to have like a really good pair of boots that gives you like movement speed, and then more movement speed on evade, and then maybe some stuff like movement speed on elite kill. And I think if you stack these kind of things, it will be all right. But the fact that Necros don't even have a mobility skill and don't really have like any other supporting tools to gain mobility is pretty awful, and is also a big reason why I think they're the most unfun class. Which brings us to the next category. In terms of fun, of course, this is extremely subjective. This is just my own personal ranking here for how much I enjoy those classes, but I have played all of them quite a lot, and I like the Rogue by far the most, which is also why I'm gonna play it on launch. This is my main, this is where I'm gonna write all the Maxwell guides. Now, of course, all of the classes are relatively well designed, I think, but this is just the coolest for me, and the Necro is the least fun for me. Very much because of those reasons here with the mobility and speed. and also because of the build diversity. So you see that this kind of like corresponds here, like all in the same line of thought basically. And then we have the other classes somewhere in between. I generally enjoy Druid. I think Druid is going to be very fun to explore, like 1,000 different options with. Kind of same with the Sorc. And then we have the Barb. Yeah, it's kind of like all right. So this is my subjective fun ranking here. Let's get into another serious category, which is group utility. So this is mostly from like a support perspective. Actually, I think support Druids turn out to be some of the most crazy stuff I've seen actually. So if you want to play as a 4-man stack, then you should probably have a support Druid or a support Barb or both. Or just in general, you can just mix and match classes and actually bring certain utility buffs to your party and try to play around that a little bit. But Druids actually have insane like utility with buffing your party and debuffing enemies, especially in terms of survivability for your party. Same goes for the Barbs, so you have speed, resource, damage, and damage reduction. You have everything you can want, basically, from the shouts. You can tank, you can pull, so there are these kind of options. And then you have, Rogue Sorc, you have like, some CCs, for example, you have vulnerable uptime, so this is the stuff you can do there. And then you have the Necro, where there's the vulnerable and decrepify, and that's about it, I feel. So in terms of support viability, not really that crazy. They're also not going to be that tanky, I believe. So they're not going to be able to just like, stand there and, survive basically. As for example, the Druid or the Barb could. So yeah. But in general, I mean, all the classes can bring some group utility. Also, maybe for your own like planning, if you have a team that you're starting with, you can definitely try to synergize, not just with those direct buffs with your party members, but also with, for example, damaging effects. So, for example, Druid has a bunch of legendaries that interact with poisons. And, well, guess what? There's a class that is really good at poisoning enemies. So, you can try to make some combo work of that. Or you can do some combo between, like, a cold imbuement rogue and a frost sorc, for example. So, if you have ice shards on your sorcerers and the rogue actually freezes stuff for you. So, there are these kind of things as well, where you can try to mix and match classes and try to have, like, synergizing builds. So, obviously, there's no real group meta established yet. This is something that we're going to see, like, evolve over time. Maybe by the time that Season 1 comes around or so, I might remake this video and we're going to have a bit of an idea of what's going on. But in general, always think about those options that you have with your team and don't just stack the same stuff. And finally, here we have the last category of my ranking, which is hardcore viability. So this is just short and sweet, I guess. We have Sorcs, Flame Shield Enchant, OP. They just literally cannot die, especially with all the little exploits that exist right now in hardcore. You're just invincible and enjoy, I guess. Then we have Druids, which I also gave an S because I think there's going to be like such tanky boys that they're going to be pretty alright. Then we have the Barbs. Once you get out the early game, I guess you're going to be fine as well because of insane amounts of defensive tools you can stack. I don't think you're going to have too much trouble playing a Barb as long as you don't get caught in, like a CC chain or something like that. But there are also ways around that. And then we have Necro and Rogue, where, I talked about the lack of defenses on the Rogue. I talked about the lack of mobility on the Necro. So, they all have their own, like, Achilles heel, so to say. And, let's see if I will make it to 100 with my hardcore Rogue on launch. And that's it for my ranking. So there's one last thing that people always ask me about, which is PvP. And I'm just gonna say, guys, just, wait it out and see. And like, we have no clue about PvP really. I think it's gonna be a one-shot fest and that's about it. But maybe not. Maybe PvP is actually gonna be like pretty interesting and like a back and forth kind of style. So let's see what happens. But for now, there's not much to say. And if you want my overall ranking of all the classes, I guess that mostly corresponds to the endgame potential because this is the one thing that really matters in an ARPG, I guess. So in that case, as I mentioned earlier, I think that Druids are going to be the number 1. Then we have the Barbs with the number 2. It could be like a bit, back and forth between them, depending on the build, depending on how things actually play out. I would say, a little bit behind those two, we have Rogue and Sorc. Hard to predict really which one is going to be the better one of those two, I'd say. But I think it's pretty clear that these two are ahead and these two are in the middle. And then we have the Necro as the last one. So this is my expectation for now. And I'm quite excited to see how my predictions will hold up here in the end. You also have to see that, for example, something that I didn't exactly rank was kind of like the mid-game part of the progression. So we have like, the first hour, so to say, 1 to 50, and then you have like the end game, like optimized stuff, which is the stuff that we've been theorycrafting on with like the end game builds here, for example. And then there's like a huge part in the middle where it's just kind of like anything can happen, I feel, like you get those huge upgrades, you find a big unique, you find big legendary that enables your build. So there's going to be like these wide swings in like power and like the feel of a build, of a class even, where you just might not have a very like enabling item that you need for your setup. So this is also something to keep in mind, that as you progress through the game, you're going to have those power spikes coming in. In any case, I hope you enjoyed my ranking. Let me know if you agree with this or not, or just what are your thoughts on this, and maybe what's your expected like best build, what are you going to play. I'd be quite curious to hear from a lot of you guys. And as I mentioned, stay tuned for those Maxwell updates. Stay tuned for a lot of YouTube uploads from my side, starting very soon. There's going to be a ton of stuff coming for launch and beyond. Hope you liked this one, and see you guys next time.